Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Kiorkof, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're going to be talking about the wide receiver strength of schedule for the 2023 fantasy football season. Now, like I've mentioned before, and like I'll mention again, one of the most important variables in fantasy football are matchups. In a given week, taking on cornerback coverage from someone like Sauce Gardner or Patrick Surtain certainly implies a difference in terms of the potential success and or failures that our fantasy prospects produce within a given week. Therefore, we want to look at the entire big picture of the 2023 season from weeks 1 through 17 in order to determine which wide receivers have the easiest strength of schedule going forward and why we want to take advantage of that opportunity. Now, before I delve into all the data and statistics that I've gathered this offseason in regards to the strength of schedule at the wide receiver position, I want to remind you guys, we're making daily fantasy football content here on the channel for the entirety of the season with the singular purpose of trying to help you win a 2023 fantasy football championship. So if you have not yet already, be sure to subscribe today. Greatly supports the channel. Thank you very much. Additionally, for those of you who want an even bigger advantage upon your league mates this upcoming season in order to ensure a fantasy football championship, of course, be sure to check out the link down in the description and travel on over to Underdog Fantasy. At this current moment in time, if you sign up using code Andrew and make a first-time deposit minimum of $10, not only are you going to get the first-time deposit match up to $100, you're additionally going to get my 2023 fantasy football draft guide, the draft rankings that are included with that. Those rankings are by position: quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end, kicker, defense, along with top 200 flex, all of that by tier, in a half PPR, full PPR, 4-point per passing touchdown, 6-point per passing touchdown. Additionally, those rankings will be updated every single week and sent to your email. Make sure you check your spam folder. I'll probably update the rankings tomorrow and send them over to everyone, so be sure to keep an eye out for that. Additionally, besides getting the rankings throughout this offseason prior to your drafts, you'll also get Sunday morning rankings from weeks 1 through 18 every week in order to help you guys make decisions for your weekly matchups so that we're making sure we're helping you capture a 2023 fantasy football championship this year. So go ahead, sign up today, use code Andrew, and make that first-time deposit minimum of $10. For those of you who are wondering whether you're eligible, be sure to go ahead and check out the map to the right side of the screen. It'll determine your eligibility based on your location. Now, for those of you who aren't eligible, there's a link down in the description of the video that offer the same services via my Patreon. You can check that out. But for those of you who are, of course, signing up, making that first-time deposit today via Underdog, be sure to draft, get some experience under your belt, and draft responsibly. Thank you very much. All right, let's get into talking about the wide receiver strength of schedule for the 2023 fantasy football season. Now, as you guys can see to the right side of the screen, we have how many points defenses allowed to opposing wide receivers over the course of the 2022 season. Now, on a per-game average, the Tennessee Titans were giving up the most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, which was an average of 33.14 half PPR fantasy points. Now, in this specific stat line that I have on the right side of the screen, we are only isolating receiving statistics for wide receivers, because going into this upcoming season, the rushing statistics that aren't guaranteed, guys like Deebo Samuel lining up in the backfield, that becomes, an out-of-position kind of context. Now, when we go ahead and isolate these statistics and insert them for the 2023 schedule, weeks 1 through 17, I found that potentially the Green Bay Packers, based on 2022 statistics, would have the easiest strength of schedule at the wide receiver position, where they would average technically 27.46 fantasy points per game based on the coverage alone, while the most difficult strength of schedule would belong to the Los Angeles Rams wide receivers. Now, please understand that I present these statistics on screen to give you a sense as to why we cannot utilize these numbers just by themselves. Because again, as we approach the 2023 season, there's a lot of positional changes within these teams. The NFL draft, free agency, trades, injuries that are absolutely going to change the compositions of these defenses, therefore the performances. So what I went ahead and did was collected all the coverage grades of DBs from the 2022 season and applied them to the potential strength of schedule for the 2023 season. As you guys can see to the left side of the screen, in terms of the graphic, we have DB coverage grades based on the 2023 starters this upcoming season. We will find that the Los Angeles Rams have the worst coverage group amongst all teams in the National Football League, while on the other end of this conversation, we have the Philadelphia Eagles with the best secondary based on their 2022 coverage grades. Now, going into this upcoming season, if we were to apply the coverage grades upon the 2023 fantasy football season in terms of schedule, weeks 1 through 17, we would find that the Pittsburgh Steelers wide receivers would have the easiest strength of schedule based on average coverage grades, while in comparison, the Miami Dolphins would definitely have a rough time, primarily because anybody that plays in the AFC East, the cornerbacks that play within that division by themselves are obviously at a higher level. So playing against each other, there's no surprise that the New England Patriots, Buffalo Bills, and of course Miami Dolphins are all at the bottom of this conversation, having the toughest potentials coverage grades in their upcoming schedule. Now, once I collected all the statistics that I presented to you guys, I went ahead, blended them all together, and applied them for the 2023 season to find the exact 2023 strength of schedule at the wide receiver position, which is as such. As you guys can see on screen, the New Orleans Saints have the easiest strength of schedule on average going into the 2023 year in comparison to the Buffalo Bills having the most difficult strength of schedule. Now let's go ahead and let's give you a little bit of an understanding as to why I present weeks 1 through 17. First of all, if you are a commissioner or you play in a league in which you have a week 18 championship, hopefully last season and all the seasons prior to that have kind of given you an understanding as to why you don't want to be playing your starters in week 18, because in many circumstances, teams that are in a position to make the NFL playoffs will not play their starters. They practically use it as a bye week in many circumstances if they've already clinched a playoff position. There's a lot of unknowns in week 18, so we want to avoid that. Now, when we talk about weeks 1 through 17, of course, we look at it as an entire broad spectrum. I will take time to look at weeks 1 through 7, 8 through 14, and of course 15 through 17, the fantasy playoffs. But just to kind of give you a couple of my thoughts, first and foremost, in terms of the 2023 strength of schedule at the wide receiver position. First and foremost, when we look at the top 12 potential teams in terms of the easiest strength of schedules going into the season, we find a lot of rookie wide receivers that are going into their second years that are going to have potential upticks of production. We talked about this a couple of days ago in terms of must draft wide receivers, second year guys that have proven success, typically almost always have even better years the following season. So guys like Chris Olave at the top of this conversation, of course, Christian Watson, Romeo Doubs, we have George Pickens, Drake London, wide receivers that absolutely should be taking steps forward, on top of the fact that they have easier strength of schedules in comparison to a lot of the other wide receivers going into the season. Now, wide receivers that are potentially slept on in a lot of circumstances that in this conversation in terms of strength of schedule have advantages. DJ Moore, who in my mind is absolutely without a doubt a wide receiver 2 going into this season, is somehow being drafted as a wide receiver 3. Perfect. I'll take the discount. I have no problem with that in any circumstance. We have the Tampa Bay Buccaneers wide receivers, Chris Godwin, Mike Evans. Of course, these are two elite level wide receivers when the quarterback production is at a high level. Can they produce with Baker Mayfield? Are we going to have another situation like Geno Smith with Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf, where both these wide receivers are still fantasy relevant despite going from an extremely good quarterback to one that was expected to be not so great? In this circumstance, you're going from the GOAT to Baker Mayfield, which obviously is a huge drop off. Nonetheless, these two guys could step up based on their strength of schedule. We have the Indianapolis Colts, Michael Pittman Jr., Alec Pierce. Michael Pittman Jr. mainly being slept on in comparison, currently sitting as a wide receiver 3. We have the Pittsburgh Steelers wide receivers, both guys, wide receiver 3 options. All these receivers that I'm mentioning are being drafted as like the 25th to 36th wide receiver off the board, which in my mind, based on strength of schedule, gives them more upside than the potential of some of these other receiving options that are available throughout that span of time. Now, like in any strength of schedule, there are going to be stud receiving options or stud players that have really easy paths to success. This year, of course, Jamar Chase and T. Higgins, Metcalf, Lockett, and Jackson Smith and Jigba all have pretty easy strength of schedules. Amon-Ra St. Brown. We have the Jacksonville Jaguars wide receivers, whether it's Ridley, Kirk, or Zay Jones, that have opportunities to succeed based on their schedules that are relatively easy. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, there are going to be wide receivers that are going to have difficult strength of schedule. For example, Diggs, Kupp, Tyreek Hill, Waddle, Lamb, Garrett Wilson, Devontae Adams, etc. These wide receivers are elite in their own right. Therefore, I'm not too worried about them regardless of the cornerback coverages that they face. Certainly, they're going to have more difficult matchups, but they are elite in their own right. Therefore, I'm not really worried about it. It kind of cancels out. And they, of course, have proven success in the past and will continue to do so this upcoming season. All right, now let's go ahead and focus on spectrums of time, specifically weeks 1 through 7 of the 2023 season. The number one thing that I immediately noticed is similar to yesterday's quarterback strength of schedule. The Los Angeles Chargers continue to be at the top of this conversation because when a quarterback is scoring, fantasy points in terms of passing yardage, of course, the wide receiver position, about 60 to 70% of those statistics are going to them. Therefore, of course, the Los Angeles Chargers wide receivers beginning this upcoming season should be fantastic. Mike Williams, Keenan Allen should be great. Of course, hopefully they can stay healthy for the entirety of the year because those contributions will absolutely make an impact. But other wide receiver options that you may not be looking at as potential stud, players, but could be good investments going into this year, especially for early on in the season if they can catch fire. Specifically, Carolina Panthers wide receivers, Adam Thielen, DJ Chark, guys that have value. Maybe you want to go and invest in someone like Mingo, the rookie wide receiver, and he could potentially become something later on in the year based on the strength of schedule. But ultimately, I wouldn't mind, investing late round ADP in someone like Adam Thielen and or Chark that could end up being the number one receiving option in this offense immediately come week 1. Now, like we've mentioned already in the past, there are going to be difficult matchups. Garrett Wilson, he has to take on in just the first 7 weeks, obviously prior to the week 7 bye, Tre'Davious White at cornerback. He has to take on Diggs. He has to take on Jack Jones. He has to take John Patrick Surtain II, Darius Slay. He has a very difficult strength of schedule in terms of cornerback coverages that he is going to face one-on-one. And that in itself is concerning. That being said, if at any point he falters early on in the season, I'm immediately trading for him because later on, as you'll see from weeks 8 through 14, it begins to pick up, and that's when he's really going to separate himself. But I mean, the volume of opportunity that he's going to get, the talent that he is, in my opinion, isn't really going to make an impact in terms of the coverages that he's going to face. He's already faced the number one coverages his rookie season. He'll once again do it this year. And if anything, the quarterback play will certainly make a huge difference in terms of the ball placement and his ability to go up against some of the better cornerbacks in the National Football League. So with this all taken into account, use the information on screen to your benefit, just putting it out there, interpret it as you will. But of course, strength of schedule makes a huge difference going into the season. Now let's talk about weeks 8 through 14 and the potential impacts of this overall spectrum of time. Specifically, similar to yesterday, we talked about Derek Carr and his incredible schedule with the New Orleans Saints, taking on teams that, quite frankly, don't have experienced quarterbacks, which could lead to their defense finding success and, of course, their offense being able to rebound off that and put up some points. Nonetheless, when we talk about Derek Carr succeeding, it in turn immediately leads to Chris Olave having himself an incredible season, like we've talked about over the course of the last 2 weeks now. Chris Olave has a huge opportunity to step up, and there's a reason why he's not only being drafted, but ranked as a top 12 potential wide receiver going into 2022. Additionally, when we talk about teams like the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, the second easiest strength of schedule throughout this span of time, taking on teams like Buffalo, of course, that's going to be a game in which they're going to be in a negative game script. They take on Houston in week 9, which typically their secondary is good, but Tennessee's secondary has been awful. So has San Francisco. So has Indianapolis. So has Carolina. Obviously, Carolina dealt with a lot of injuries last year. And in Atlanta, of course, a division matchup, typically these two wide receivers, Evans and Godwin, find success. So there is a potential in which this team plays in a negative game script all season long. And if they do, they're going to be throwing the entire time. And regardless of who's at quarterback, there is going to be a potent amount of value in these matchups for wide receivers like Evans and Godwin to be able to find success. And if they find the end zone, my goodness, they're going to be even more valuable prospects that are often going to be in that wide receiver 2 conversation throughout the season. Now, one of the teams that jumped out to me, besides the ones at the top of this overall conversation, in regards to the potential of a wide receiver stepping up throughout this span of time, is the Minnesota Vikings, and in association, Jordan Addison, the rookie wide receiver out of USC. USC wide receivers in the National Football League have been absolute hits on pretty much majority of the occasions that we have seen. We're talking about Drake London, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Michael Pittman Jr., Juju Smith-Schuster, Nelson Aguilar, Marquise Lee, prior to his injury, after the injury was pretty much done, and Robert Woods. There have been a lot of success. I mean, those are all the wide receivers that have been drafted out of USC. I'm not even missing any, right? So if we're talking about wide receivers as of late that have come out of that school, that have found success, Jordan Addison is just going to be the next upon this long list of stud wide receivers that university has produced. So I don't mind the idea of potentially grabbing him, stashing him, and then eventually, throughout this span of time, potentially finding a lot of success as he steps up in that wide receiver 2 role and accumulates all of that opportunity that Adam Thielen saw last season, which was, of course, 100+ targets available to him. Outside of that, let's go ahead and move on to the fantasy playoffs, weeks 15 through 17. Again, another reminder, be sure that your fantasy championship game is on week 17. You don't want to be playing in a week 18 championship with teams potentially sitting their starters, whether it is Travis Kelce or Patrick Mahomes, Joe Burrow, Jamar Chase. If you don't have those stud options available to you, is your team really the championship team that got you there? No. So make sure that your championship game is in week 17. Okay, a couple of the thoughts that I had in regards to the final 3 weeks of the season. Of course, there's a long distance between the beginning of the year and getting here. There is going to be, a little bit of an inconsistency. By the time we get to weeks 15 through 17, the overall strength of schedule can be different based on injuries, based on trades, based on free agent signings that these defenses make. And certainly there is going to be variables such as defenders improving and or getting worse over time. That's obviously how the game of football works. If you're not getting better, you're getting worse. And that's just, that's the name of the game. Therefore, by the time we get here, could look a little bit different, but at this current moment in time, based on, of course, what we saw in 2022 and what we expect to see in 2023 based on coverage grades, etc., all those data and statistics gathered together, we find that the Green Bay Packers wide receivers would have the easiest strength of schedule throughout the fantasy playoffs. I mean, immediately my mind goes to Christian Watson, the touchdown upside, and the ability there. Second-year wide receivers. I mean, Romeo Doubs is still on that team as well. We have Drake London, who's in this conversation with the second easiest strength of schedule. We have the Kansas City Chiefs in this conversation. If Sky Moore, by the time we get there, is healthy and ready to go, I mean, he could be the primary slot receiver for this offense as Kadarius Toney maybe moves elsewhere. If that is of value, again, these could be wide receivers we might want to invest in. Additionally, guys like Zay Flowers, a rookie wide receiver for the Baltimore Ravens, but in association with this offense, could eventually be the starter if he's able to overtake someone like Odell Beckham Jr. or Rashad Bateman within the offense, or if they're going to continue to play 11 personnel, 3 wide sets, maybe they just go ahead and air it out all season long and he finds value earlier, and it could be even more relevant later on in the season in the fantasy playoffs. But as we look at this specific spectrum of time, the number one thing that popped up to me is, of course, some of the stud receiving options that are going to have easier strength of schedules. The Cincinnati Bengals, whether it was Joe Burrow yesterday and now Jamar Chase and T. Higgins going into the spectrum of time in which they have Minnesota. Secondary was awful last season. Pittsburgh, they've made some improvements, but again, by the time we get to week 16, could be a mess. And then you have, of course, the Kansas City Chiefs. The last time we saw Jamar Chase take on the Kansas City Chiefs in a fantasy playoff game, 2021, week 16, 50.1 fantasy points, 11 catches, 266, 3 touchdowns. We could have another one of those explosive performances. It's definitely not a guarantee, but something that absolutely jumps off screen in terms of the potential. Now, at the other end of this conversation, we have the Tennessee Titans, DeAndre Hopkins, Treylon Burks. By the time we get to weeks 15 through 17, Treylon Burks could have already established himself as the number one guy. That very well could be the case, but only time will tell. Now, before we close out this video today, I want to go ahead and once again pop up on screen weeks 1 through 17, the strength of schedule. There is a lot of potential for wide receivers that are being slept on to have a lot of value. Wide receiver 2s, wide receiver 3s. Of course, the wide receiver 1s in this conversation that are immediately of value, Jamar Chase, T. Higgins potentially, those guys are obviously coming off the boards. But guys that you might want to seek in terms of grabbing them later on in your draft who could end up being extremely high valued prospects that you can not only benefit from, but potentially end up taking and flipping for a trade later on in the season. Guys associated with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers offense, of course, those 2 stud wide receivers. The Steelers receiving options, of course, with Deontay Johnson and George Pickens. With Kenny Pickett potentially taking a step forward this season, we could see both those guys being of value. Specifically, George Pickens taking that second-year jump. And, of course, Deontay Johnson, the target machine that he is within that offense with Matt Canada, of course, being the number one option, will continue to get littered with targets. If he's able to catch a majority of them, which are potentially more accurate this season, of course, the sky's the limit. All right, that's going to cover it for me today. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Tomorrow, we'll talk about the running back strength of schedule for the 2023 season, give you guys context regarding that, and all of the data and statistics that I've gathered in order to help us approach our drafts and find the most overall success in 2023. If you have not yet already, click the like button down below, subscribe to the channel. We're trying to get to 100,000 subscribers this season, so be sure to support in that regard. We're making daily fantasy football content, of course, to try to help you win some fantasy championships. Additionally, again, if you haven't checked out the link down in the description, when you travel to Underdog Fantasy and use code Andrew to sign up and make a first-time deposit minimum of $10, again, you're going to get that first-time deposit match. You're also going to get my 2023 fantasy football draft guide, the rankings every single Sunday morning from weeks 1 through 18, half PPR, full PPR, by position, by tier, in order to help you guys set your lineups and capture some championships. Thank you, everybody, for watching, and until tomorrow, I'll see you guys. Peace.